Well, good morning. Thank you for joining, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled that we have a little bit of time together. Of course, I'm coming to you from Japan, and we live in that kind of a world now where we can connect with anybody, anywhere, at any time, and that's a wonderful thing about something like this webinar. So for those of you who don't know me, I've written, I think it's 13 books now, I've lost count. The most recent one, Agents to Agency, which I published in Australian English with Hawker Brownlow, focusing on Australian curriculum and Australian educational needs. And this seminar, this webinar, is really about that book and the content of that book and how it relates to version 9 of the curriculum. So I live in Japan. Obviously, you can tell that there's some aspect of that. I live in Kamakura in the south of Japan, and my day starts very early. I train in the Zen temples here, starting 3 or 4 in the morning before I start all my work with schools. So I'm wide awake. I hope you are. I hope you're also wide awake and ready to go. And I'm just going to dive into some thinking. So, you know, we're all busy, and it's Wednesday, it's the middle of the week, so, you know, the plan that you had on Sunday is already gone. And now you're dealing with something new. But I want to share with you a concept from Japan that really might change your thinking a little bit, and that's the concept of ichigo ichie, which it's on my business cards, and it's very common for people to have that. And it means one time, one meeting. And essentially the bigger meaning behind it is that your entire life led to this moment. So treasure its unrepeatable nature. Take advantage of this time that you have here. Be here fully. Enjoy being here fully. And take as much value as you can from this conversation. So I want to leave as much time as I can for questions, and I'll try to look at the questions in the chat as they come up. But I'll start with this question. Who is responsible for the learning in your classroom and in your school? And I'd like you to just, you know, respond to it. You can respond to it in chat, respond to it in your head, but don't overthink it. Just the first thing that comes into your mind, who's responsible? And when I have this conversation, quite often people will say, well, you know, it's the students, or it's the teachers, or it's the principal, or it's the parents, or, you know, it's somebody. And then usually we end up with this answer of, well, everyone. And, you know, that's a comfortable answer. But, you know, my response is usually then, okay, well, then if learning is failing in the school, you know, who gets dismissed? Everyone? Like, there's has to be some sense of accountability. And this question is really problematic for us because we look at it through an educational mindset. But if I change this question and take out in your classroom and in your school and ask, who's responsible for the learning in your life? That changes very quickly for us. We recognize that, well, we're responsible. I mean, no one can learn for us, and we can't learn for our learners. They have to learn for themselves. It's not something that happens inside of the teacher. Learning happens inside of the learner. So ultimately, we're responsible for the learning in our lives, and ultimately, learners are responsible for the learning in the school. And so that means that they need to be in charge of it, and that's what agency is. And voice and agency are used together, separately, or interchangeably, with really no clarity of what they are or how it happens. And in Victoria, you have voice, agency, leadership, all, like, it's one word. You do just a whole, I think every letter in the alphabet's in there. Voice, agency, leadership is one thing. And we use these words, we say them together. Well, we need more voice and agency, but they're completely different. And I want to just start by clarifying what they are. In simple terms, if learners have a voice, they have a vote. If they have agency, they have autonomy, and that's the difference between voice and agency. Voice, you get to have your say. Agency, you largely get to have your way. And of course, there's still an aspect of things that are mutually determined, but it means being in charge of and being responsible for your learning. So the book Agents to Agency was really to, you know, everyone's talking about agency, but nobody has a clear idea what it was or what it is. And that's what the focus of this book is. It really centers on one simple question. Are your learners agents of the teacher, or have they agency over learning? And that's the difference between agents and agency. And I want to go through what the differences are if we were to imagine in your school what you see when you look at agents or agency. If students are agents of the teacher, then the learning is prescribed as opposed to self-determined. As a result, then it becomes a low degree of relevance for the learners, where it would have a high degree of relevance if it was in a pedagogy of agency. In an agents environment, teachers are assessing after learning as opposed to learners assessing as learning. It's the difference between teachers talking, students listening, and then learners and mentors discussing. In an agents environment, the focus is really on knowledge delivery, where it's knowledge creation when we're looking at agency. And as a result, because we're talking about teachers talking, students listen, knowledge delivery, it ends up being single discipline as opposed to transdisciplinary. It's a very controlled environment when we're looking at an agents environment, and it's self-regulated when we look at agency. And to sum it up very, very succinctly, and this is how I present it in the pedagogy of the book, it's the pedagogy of oppression or the pedagogy of agency. Like that's the difference between the two. And it sounds harsh, but I'll clarify as we move on. It comes down to choice, control, and pace. The more those are in the hands of the teacher, the more you move towards a pedagogy of agents. The more they are in the hands of the learner, you're moving towards a pedagogy of agency. So, right away, one of the first things that comes up for people is, well, what about explicit teaching? Is that in opposition or detrimental to agency? And I would say absolutely not. Here's the thing that we have to understand. Explicit teaching or explicit instruction or direct teaching, depending on where you are and what term you use, that is not a pedagogy. This is the important thing to recognize. That's not a pedagogy. It is simply a tool in your arsenal of tools that are used within your pedagogy. But the question is, what is your pedagogy? That's the ultimate question. And so there is no issue with explicit teaching or explicit instruction. It's very, very good as a tool inside of a pedagogy of agency. If all you do is explicit teaching all day long, it's a pedagogy of oppression. I hope that helps to make it clear. So it can be a valuable tool. If we look at how I went to school and how a traditional classroom is set up, largely you have a teacher and you have a degree of learners. And we would like to think of it this way, but in fact, if the teacher is leading the instruction, then we're only actually teaching to one learner. We're optimized for that one learner. And other learners will, thrive to a certain extent in that environment. And we call this group the happy middle. Then there are learners that perform very well in that kind of an environment. And we often call them gifted or advanced. And I certainly don't take issue that there are gifted and advanced learners, but I don't think that the measure of that should be that they perform well in a teacher-centered environment. That's not the measure of gifted or advanced to me. But what we do with those learners is we give them agency, we allow them to regulate their learning, we give them choice, we allow them to focus on knowledge creation and things that are highly relevant to them, and they thrive. It's very, very interesting how much they thrive when you do this. And then we have another group of learners that do not work well in this environment, and we have various labels for this. Now, again, I want to make it clear, I'm not suggesting that there are not learners who are that have learning difficulties or learning challenges. Those are real and they do exist. But again, I don't think the measure of that should be whether or not they perform well in a teacher-centered environment that is not necessarily relevant to them. And here's what we do with those learners. Here's the irony of it is that we put them in an environment where we prescribe the learning more, we control it more, we focus more on single discipline, more on knowledge delivery, less on relevance. So what we actually do is the same things that put them in that environment in the first place, except we do it louder and slower. And I mean, how do we think that that's going to work? So then we start to modify tasks, and that is not personalization. It's differentiation. That's what it is. When you take the same task and you modify it for abilities, it's not personalization. We like to use the word personalization because it sounds better, but personalization means focusing on what's relevant to that learner in this moment and making it personal for them, which is different than differentiation. It is almost impossible to personalize learning in a teacher-centered pedagogy, and it's virtually impossible for learning not to be personalized in the pedagogy of agency. Let's look at the two of them as a model before we get into version 9 of the curriculum and how it relates to all of this. In the pedagogy of oppression, we start with a curriculum, which I like to think of as secret teacher business. I don't know why it's a secret, but we hang on to it, and when we don't share it, and it's something that only we have access to or we know about, except that it's on the ACARA website and anybody can see it. So I don't know why we keep it a secret teacher business, but it becomes secret teacher business that's in the knowledge and the care of a teacher who is the one who does all the work. And in my work with schools and teachers around the world, my job is to make teachers work less. Ultimately, we need to use the most underutilized resource in the classroom, who are the learners. And in this environment, they are the ones that we're calling the oppressed. And please have a sense of humor as you're looking through this with me. I want you to really think about what this actually means. The secret teacher business is held by the teacher who does all the work, and then the students are the end of that chain. Except that, as I said, different learners perform differently in that environment. So as we get to higher levels, then we bring in other oppressors who are experts in their particular content area and join in on the oppression together. So I'm making a lot of fun when I say oppression, and it triggers people. People think, well, we're not oppressing them. Well, let's just look at what the definition of oppression is. Oppression is the prolonged exercise of authority preventing opportunity and freedom. And I think that that's a very clear description for what that type of a pedagogy is. As opposed to agency, which is the capacity, condition, and power to take action or to choose what action to take. In a pedagogy of agency, it's different. We start with the learner, and we say learner-centered all the time, but rarely do I see it. The learner has to be the one who is responsible, and the learner needs to have that access to the curricular objectives, which are no longer secret teacher business, but are mutually determined outcomes. It's not a do whatever you want. There is certainly curriculum that we need to accomplish. And that happens through and in partnership with a mentor who is an experienced and trusted advisor. Now, actually, I shouldn't just say mentor, I should say mentors, because we can bring in other educational professionals, we can bring in other learners, we can bring in industry leaders. Everybody can come into that conversation and liaise with both the learner and the mentor in relation to the curricular objectives. Now, that's not necessarily dramatically different than what you're doing right now. It's just that there is a point in which we move responsibility to the learners, and I'll explain that as we get into the curricular conversation. The important part of this is that we should not see learning as the outcome of teaching, but rather allow teaching to become a mindful response to learning. That's ultimately what our endpoint should be. When learners first come to us in kindergarten, we give them a high degree of agency because it would be impossible not to. They're not going to tolerate anything else, really. But as we move through the school system and through the years, we start to kind of remove some of that. And we start to say things like, I need you to listen to me, or we don't have time for that, or our focus is this today. And by the time we get into year 9, really there's very little agency. Well, maybe you get to choose your language if you're in a school that has more than one language, but largely there's not a lot of agency. And by the time we get to year 12, there's an elective that you take, which is, and that's about it, right? And here's the problem with this decrease that we go through in the school system of agency, or in the school system as we move to more and more of an agent's environment. When those learners leave us, should their educational path be university, and all of you who are teachers have been through university, so you will remember arriving at university and thinking, why is no one teaching me? What is this person talking about? Because at the university level, you were expected to be fully functional, capable, independent learners and have complete agency over your learning, and no one's going to help you. How do we think that's possible? How do we think that in the 3 months from when learners leave year 12 until they arrive at university, that somehow it's going to happen? We take on all that responsibility at the year 12 level. We do all the work, and we choose to do all the work. It should be the opposite. The year 12 teacher should have the easiest job as far in the system. And when I say easy, I mean it needs to be defined what I mean by easy, but the most responsibility should be on the learners, not on the teacher. And when we look at George Land's book, Breakpoint and Beyond, he talked about a longitudinal study of 25 years looking at what percentage of learners demonstrated genius-level divergent thinking. So we're talking about the same people. And it's probably not a surprise that when they were in kindergarten, that 98% of his cohort of learners were able to demonstrate divergent thinking at a very, very high level, or a genius-like level. What's interesting is as they move through the school system, 3 years later, 3 to 5 years later, when they're 8 to 10 years old, that number has changed. It's no longer 98, it's down to 32% of them demonstrate that level of thinking. And by the time they're 13 to 15 years old, it's down to 10%. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that this illustration aligns with the previous illustration, that the more agency we give learners, the more capacity for divergent thinking that they have. Now, a few words about agency, a few things that I want to make really clear. It's not about doing whatever you want. And people that are working with inquiry also run into this. They go, well, what if learners want to do this, or what if learners want to do that, and that's not what I want them to do? It's not about doing whatever you want. It's not a free-for-all. It's the aim, firstly, is to develop responsible, capable, independent learners. And that happens through personalization, which is the most efficient way if everyone is on their individual learning pathway, in order to achieve mutually determined outcomes while building confidence and capacity through self-direction and self-reflection. That also is what's building the general capabilities for us, and it's what allows us to be as effective as possible. It moves responsibility for the learning from the teacher, where it traditionally has been, to the learner, where it should be. It's their learning. We talked about that on the very, very first slide. So a question that I have for you, as we move forward, as you start to think about that, is to recognize that all learners are on their unique learning pathway. Everybody is on their unique learning pathway anyways. We all are. And so everyone really requires an individual learning plan. And for me, when I'm working with schools, that means that teachers also need their individual learning plan for professional learning. So systems, structures, and traditions really need to be either created or removed to facilitate this reality. So I'm going to ask you, I'll continue to move forward with this conversation, but I'm going to ask you to post in the chat what you think are those very first things. What structures, systems, and traditions must be either created or removed to support agency? Please drop your thoughts in the chat, because I'm going to be very interested to see what you think in relation to that. Now that brings us then to a conversation around the version 9 of the Australian curriculum. And there's one of the things that I run into in professional learning is different states will have a different idea around this. So Victoria has Vic Curric, and often teachers will say to me, well, we don't do Australian curriculum, we do Vic Curric. Well, actually, you do Australian curriculum. It's incorporated within Victorian curriculum, and that's part of a national agreement that you have. Every state actually is dealing with this. So regardless of whether you're in Victoria or whether you're in New South Wales or whether you're in the ACT or any place else in Australia, you are dealing with Australian curriculum, and you're actually missing something by not going to the ACARA website and really looking at the great resources that are there. I work with curricula all over the world. And when I'm in Dubai, I will work with Indian curriculum one day, UK curriculum the next day, and American curriculum the next day, and be expected to be able to thrive in all of those. And I'll tell you that Australia has one of the richest, most beautiful curriculums in the world, and I think you should be incredibly proud to have it. There's a lot of potential for you when you look at it correctly. There are 3 dimensions of the Australian curriculum, and I think that everybody understands this, that there's 8 learning areas: English, maths, science, health and physical education, humanities and social sciences, the arts, technologies, and then the variety of languages. There are 7 general capabilities: critical and creative thinking, digital literacy, ethical understanding, intercultural understanding, literacy, numeracy, and personal social capability. I don't think that these are a surprise to any of you, and they haven't really changed. And there are 3 cross-curriculum priorities, which focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures, Asia and Australia's engagement with Asia, and then sustainability are those 3 cross-curriculum priorities. Now, here's the thing, is that when we look at it strictly in this way, we go, well, that's fine and everything, but what is it that I'm meant to teach? And I think that it's important to remember, firstly, that, and I see this all the time. It's somebody mentioned it in the chat already about the mass amount of curriculum, and I'm going to help you break through that. The first thing is, if we stop saying, I have a lot of curriculum to teach, and we shift that to, learners have a lot of curriculum to learn. That's the first mindset. We really have to get our heads around, this is the learner's responsibility. How are we going to facilitate and support them in accomplishing this? So, what does this mean then as far as these three things go? It means that when we look at learning areas and general capabilities and cross-curricular priorities, we have to understand the intention behind them. General capabilities are defined in the Australian curriculum as the knowledge, skills, behaviors, and dispositions for young Australians to live and work successfully. In other words, they are the end goal or the outcome of the Australian curriculum. The general capabilities are what you're trying to accomplish. They're your end point. They're not something that we say, well, that's nice and it's out there. There's actually an assessment framework for them and a whole lot of focus on them. And there's more than just literacy or numeracy. There's a whole bunch of them that are general capabilities. The cross-curricular priorities are defined as that they support the Australian curriculum to be a relevant, contemporary, and engaging curriculum that reflects national, regional, and global contexts. In other words, the cross-curriculum priorities are the context in which the general capabilities are developed. This is really important. The general capabilities are where you're going. The cross-curricular priorities are the vehicle that's going to get you there, and they're going to get you there through the different learning areas. That's an important understanding. Another important understanding, and it's stated very, very clearly on their website, is that cross-curriculum priorities, and I've combined the two of them because they both say exactly the same thing, cross-curriculum priorities and general capabilities are incorporated throughout the learning areas. They are not separate learning areas or subjects. They provide opportunities to enrich the learning areas where most appropriate and authentic, allowing students to engage and better understand their world. Now, here's the important part of that. They are not separate learning areas or subjects. So there's a huge trend in Australia to have literacy and numeracy as a block of time. Why? Literacy and numeracy are outcomes. They're not subjects. They're outcomes. So if we have a literacy and a numeracy block, do we also have a critical and creative thinking block, or an intercultural understanding block, or a social capability block? They are incorporated within the curriculum, and they're meant to be outcomes. And that's an important shift we need to get back to, is that these are endpoints. Now, when we look at the learning areas themselves, they are defined as the essential knowledge and understanding that and skills that students should learn. Notice the language, that students should learn. It's important. It's their responsibility. And in the learning areas, there are several sections. There's the introduction, the rationale, the aims, the structure, the key considerations, and the key connections. These are all in the introduction to each of the learning areas. Even if you are in Victoria and you think you're working with Vic Crick, please go to the ACARA website and have a look at the learning areas and look at these particular sections of the learning area. Most importantly is to look at the rationale and the aims and the key connections. Those three things are critical because they are what's going to allow you to understand so much about how this learning area connects to other learning areas, connects to the general capabilities, and what's meant to happen in this. This is where you're going to find the essential understandings and the critical concepts that you're looking for inside of the curriculum. So I would say those are three areas that everyone should have a very deep look at. So the second part of the learning areas is when you get into the content area of the learning areas. Now everyone take a big breath because I'm about to say something that's going to be very uncomfortable for you. There's four different parts of this. I think it's four, yeah. Year and band level descriptions, achievement standards is the second part, content descriptors is the third part, and content elaborations is the fourth part. And they all tie together. Now, I want to just make something really, really clear. Notice that achievement standards describe the expected quality of learning that students should typically demonstrate by the end of each year or two-year band. And achievement standards that are accompanied by annotated work examples to assist teachers to make judgments about the extent to which the achievement standard has been met. This is a gift that you have this in Australian curriculum. It does not exist in many other countries. And it's just a golden opportunity for you. So the areas that you should focus on here, you should have a good look through the band and year level descriptors, because they're going to tell you what you're trying to accomplish. Now, this is the most important part in the Australian curriculum, the achievement standards. The achievement standards are where I want you to focus, because they're what learners are meant to do. They're what they're meant to demonstrate. They are the end point. A lot of people focus on content descriptors. We want to just simplify and just go right to the end. Well, just tell me what it is that I have to teach. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff in content descriptors, and you do not need all of those content descriptors in order for someone to arrive at the achievement standards. The important thing is to understand that the achievement standards are what learners are meant to achieve, and you may select from content descriptors if you wish to, in order to arrive at those achievement standards. That's how I would explain it. The achievement standards are really your end point, and so focus on them. When I'm working with a school, I don't allow conversations around content descriptors at all. We're focusing on achievement standards because they are the end point. Now, how does this tie together when we look at a pedagogy of agency? If this secret teacher business is not to exist anymore and it's meant to be learner business, then learners have to understand it. And the way that learners can get to understand that is by us understanding it and then sharing it with learners. One of the best ways is through the use of learning intentions. And I talk about this extensively in the book and in my master classes. But the first thing is being clear on the language. So what is a learning intention? A learning intention describes the concepts and understandings we want students to learn and internalize. In other words, they are the achievement standards. Your learning intentions are your achievement standards in Australian Curriculum version 9. Pretty much, period. If you have that mindset, it's going to greatly free up what you do in the classroom. How you arrive at those are going to be individualized and personalized. Now, the reason that I focus on this language so much is because we talk about learning intentions. Some of us have even tried learning intentions, but we don't necessarily do it with fidelity. And in the schools I work with, we use this to a very high level to accomplish agency. And it starts by us being clear that there's a difference between a learning intention and a lesson objective. Now, a lesson objective might contain the various tasks and activities that'll drive the learning for students. In other words, learning intentions are what we're learning. Lesson objectives is what we're doing. And this is why Walt and Wilt are problematic, because they're not about the learning intentions. They're about what you're actually doing. Learning intentions are much bigger. They're going to span a unit. They're going to span a term. In the book, I break down some examples of what this looks like, and one of the exercises in the master classes is in the network is to go through this as well. You know, we look at these are achievement standards from Australian curriculum years 3 to 5, and I've got them from early learning up to up to the very end. But I'm just going to share with you a couple of examples. You know, if this is the learning intention, then these are what the lesson objectives might be. If at year 3 we're looking to compare and analyze complex texts explaining literal and implied meaning, then we might be exploring texts and that highlight issues and problems in making moral decisions. We might be discussing levels of language and how they're appropriate. And you understand, this is what we're doing, but this is what we're learning, and they're two completely different things. It's the same at year 9 and 10 level. We have exactly the same conversation that we can have here. This is the first thing that we need to understand, is the difference between what we're learning and what we're doing. And when achievement standards are our learning intentions and span an entire unit, it provides us some great opportunities. Second part of that conversation is to understand that learning doesn't stand alone and that it's connected along any learning journey. So what we're learning right now came from somewhere, and it is going somewhere else. I'm going to give you an example from Haas out of Australian Curriculum version 9. If you read the Haas Year 7 achievement standards about identifying and describing continuities and changes for different groups, and you look at what that would have been in year 6 and what leads to it in year 8, and this is another thing, is that we don't look across multiple year levels or multiple bands, but we should. Because here's your opportunity. You're going to have learners in your classroom that are at different levels. Here's the continuum of how you can work with them in different year levels at the same time, or give them an extension on what they're doing now. And again, in the book, we go through and we break down some examples for you, but it's important that we look at the continuity of those achievement standards. So never mind the content descriptors, focus on achievement standards, they're where you're going, and then look at what led to this one and where this one is going to. Some notes about learning intentions. They're about essential understandings, critical concepts, and individual perspectives. They are not about content. And that's why the areas that I focused on in version 9 of the curriculum, the rationale, the year level descriptors, the achievement standards, that's where you want to be looking, because they're going to help you to understand what those essential understandings, critical concepts, and individual perspectives are. Now, Jay McTighe, who I adore, he's a wonderful man. His work was largely based in America in helping people to understand what these things were, because they don't exist in American curriculum. So it's a content-based curriculum, and from there, Jay's work was about pulling out what are those essential understandings, that's why understanding by design was the focus. In Australian curriculum, you have the gift that it's already there for you. You just have to read it and start working with it. Now, because they're this way, because they're not about content and they're essential understandings, they're going to be over outcomes that happen over weeks, months, or even years. And so therefore, it's impossible to unpack at the start of a lesson. It just can't be done. Now, when we do unpack, that's the next conversation that we talk about in Agents Agency, is how we go around unpacking. When we look at any of these achievement standards, they're going to have a verb, which is some sort of an action, and then they're going to have a group of objects. And I'll give you an example of one. Here is one from Haas, year 8, I believe. Describes and explains the significance of people, groups, places, and events to the development of Australia. Now, what I encourage people to do is, if you're going to unpack this, and take a whole lot of time to do this, take a lesson, take 2 lessons, take a week, it doesn't matter, because there's huge value in this, and as I'll explain. I'll just underline the verbs, and then circle the objects, and start unpacking this. Now, do not move it into kid-friendly language. Use the language of the curriculum the way that it's written. Use the achievement standard as it is written with the learners. Why? Because this is a literacy lesson. This is why we don't need a dedicated literacy block, because if we spend a half a day unpacking this sentence and look at the different verbs and the objects and the construct of this sentence, we're going to find something very, very interesting, which is that learners build their capacity with this language. I'll give you an example. Here's one from a kindergarten in the ACT. And I just want you to see, recognizes the letters of the English alphabet in upper and lower case and knows and uses the most common sounds represented by letters. Imagine the rich conversation that is happening. You can actually see it here, where learners are just, well, what is the English alphabet? And then what's uppercase and lowercase? And what are sounds? And just unpacking this sentence, accomplishes most of the learning already, but also makes clear for learners and builds their capacity at a much higher level than you would expect. Here's one from year 1 and 2. Describe how people in different places are connected to each other and identify factors that influence these connections. And you can see just from this photograph that I took of the conversation that was happening in the school, and as a result, the deep level of understanding that learners have. Now, here is a group of learners looking at 3 different learning intentions that they've unpacked during the year, and they're focusing on which one they're going to do in their showcase. What's interesting is that in a lot of schools, when I show up, I'm large, I'm white, I'm dressed in like I'm dressed, and I'm unusual in schools, right? And I stand out. Normally, kids would stare at me, but the schools that I work with, I find when I go in there, they're not interested in adults at all. They're busy working because they're in charge of their own learning. It's quite amazing. Even when I come into a school in Japan, it's the same kind of conversation. I want you to look at this picture because what's absent in this picture is a teacher. And what these learners are doing, and again, they're all working together, and they're working very well together. They're focusing on this achievement standard, which is learners recognize how strengths and achievements continue to contribute to identities. What I don't have time to talk to you about today that I wish that I did is that in the schools we work with, we have learners unpack, and it's in the Agents Agency book, we unpack the learning intentions, and learners build success criteria against 6 levels of Bloom's. So these learners who are year 1 learners, year 1 or 2 learners, are able to look at that achievement standard after working with us for a year. They're able to look at that achievement standard, they understand what it means, and they can build their own success criteria against 6 levels of Bloom's. And to show you the outcome of that work, just to give you an example of how it's possible, it's pretty amazing when learners do this. And I have a thing called Bloom's Zoonomy, which is one of the resources in my network that will allow people, a really great way to bring Bloom's to young learners. And gosh, they're able to do it. When I show this to high school teachers, it really challenges, do we need to be doing as much as we're doing for learners? If at year 1 they're able to unpack achievement standards and build success criteria against levels of Bloom's, well, what's preventing that from happening at the high school? And it's largely our domination of everything, our control of everything. If we let it go and put it in the hands of the learner, you will be surprised how much they can thrive. So how do we measure success in creating agency? In the book, I've got continuums across 6 different areas that have 8 different levels. First is the learning foundation. What are we basing the learning on? What are the conversations happening in relation to learning? The purpose, the success criteria, goal setting, and assessment are the 6 different areas that we focus on in continuums in the book that will allow you to really understand about how you're moving from agents to agency. What I want to do in the next 10 minutes that we have together is, focus on a concept called Lesson 0. And before I do that, I'll share with you one of these continuums. And we'll look at the learning foundation one. So in each of the continuums, I have, this is what the teacher is doing, and then this is what the learner is doing, and then here's what the teacher is definitely not doing. But in the learning foundation one, it's only what the teacher is doing. So I'll share this with you to give you some idea. At an agent's level, if the learning foundation is that lessons are developed based on curricular content, this is something I would put at level 1. Level 2 is identifying the critical concepts and essential understandings within the curriculum to develop lessons. That's a step up. Level 3 is decides an appropriate and challenging learning intentions based on critical concepts and essential understandings within the curriculum and designs lessons that will enable learners to achieve them. Somebody asked about the recording. Yes, the Hawker Brownlow will be distributing the recording. I also will be posting the recording and the slides inside of my network, and I'll give you a link to that at the end of it. At level 4, presents the learning intention or intentions as an end point for a series of lessons. You can see this is now starting to focus more on the learning as opposed to the doing. At level 5, connects learning intentions to the individual perspectives, interests, and experiences of the learners. At level 6, constantly asks learners to determine the next logical steps in learning. And you can see we're moving more and more into the hands of the learners. At a level 7, engages learners in self-reflection to support self-assessment. And by level 8, is supporting learners in development and evolution of their individual learning plan, connecting learners with relevant learning opportunities beyond the scope of the classroom or school. So this gives you an example of what one of the continuums looks like. And we challenge teachers to identify where your practice is with non-judgment. It doesn't matter where you are. What you're doing right now is excellent. So where are you now? And then what's the next logical step? It's very, very simple to go about it that way. And just look for that next personalization opportunity for you as a teacher. Now, all of this kind of comes down to a concept that I came up with called Lesson 0, which has been really well received in the educational community, and John Hattie loved it when he saw it and gave me a great reference on the book. I was so pleased. But so did Anthony Muhammad and some other great educators as well, because this came from working in Dubai with a group of teachers that really were struggling to, well, how long should I take to unpack the learning intention? How many minutes should it take? How many blocks of time should it take? It takes as long as it takes. So I just came out of my mouth, which so often does when I'm presenting. I said, well, before the first lesson, there should be like a lesson 0, which is like, where do we start before we begin the instruction? And gosh, it resonated with people, and so I just stuck with it. But lesson 0 means establishing the learning intentions, which is what we're learning, and then the success criteria, which is how will we know we are successful. And first is to unpack those learning intentions and establish purpose. The second is to co-construct the success criteria. Now, actually, to be fair, especially early on, you do this ahead. You don't actually co-construct it. You do it yourself because you need to be clear on what that success criteria is, and then you lead learners to arrive at that same point. Once you've been doing this a while, teachers that I've been working with for a year, they just do this on the fly because they're so comfortable doing it. It becomes really natural to you. And then the third is that learners reflect on what success criteria they have already met and determine their first steps. In other words, where are you at now? That's diagnostic assessment. Maybe you already know this. Maybe you can demonstrate this. Maybe you have evidence of this, or maybe you're not even at this point yet, but we need to know that. Learners need to be able to identify that for themselves. And so, that's lesson 0, and it kind of sits at this point. Now, how is it done? So lesson 0 could be one block of time, it could be a week, it doesn't matter. It's what is establishing this, and the time that you invest in lesson 0, I promise you, pays off exponentially as far as how quickly you achieve results and at what level you achieve them. So then what does lesson 1 look like? Well, we would start with a lesson objective. And the lesson objective is what we're doing. It's a purposeful activity. And purposeful means that it connects between the learning intentions and the success criteria. And then as appropriate, during and at the end of the lesson, success criteria is referenced for learners to consider progress and evidence. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Here's the lesson objective. Here's the purposeful activity. Can you see the connection to the success criteria? Yes, you can. Wonderful. Purpose has now been established. And so that constant question of are we there yet, and what do we know and what do we have evidence of, is constantly in the learner's mind. And then the next steps are determined collectively. So when you look at this as a series of lessons, and here's the difference between the pedagogy of oppression and the pedagogy of agency. For me, when I was in school, and I think for many learners even today, first, you have a lesson that's presented to you, and you don't know why, but you're there, and then there's another one that comes, and then there's another one that comes, and another one that comes, and they just keep coming, and you have no idea why. It's just this thing is happening, and this stuff is being presented to you, and when will I use this in the real world, and why is this meaningful to me? All of those kind of questions come, and then at some point in time, we're dropped in with an evaluation. And for this is a giant mess in a learner's mind. It's like, how does this all connect? It just doesn't make sense. If we want to simplify this process, if we want to make it clear, then we really need to start with the success criteria. Never mind the assessment, start with the success criteria, which are the achievement standards. What are you trying to achieve? Work that backwards to the learning intentions. Then when we begin with lesson 0, which, let me remind you, lesson 0, learners are reflecting on what success criteria they have already met, and they're reflecting on progress and evidence as they move forward. The next steps are determined collectively. You see, what happens if, by the time you get to the 4th lesson, that learners are already there? What if they've arrived at the success criteria? Well, it means that we're done. It means that we don't need lessons 5, 6, and 7 because we're already at the success criteria. And what we've saved is the thing that everyone says they don't have enough of, which is time. The end of learning is not when we run out of lessons. It's when the success criteria is achieved. I get this all the time. Why does this unit take 12 lessons? Because we planned 12 lessons. So of course it's going to take 12 lessons. The first iteration of lesson 0 that I did at the Millennium School in Dubai, which is Indian curriculum, very content heavy, and there one of the deputy principals was also the year 11 biology teacher, and she was a wonderful, wonderful master teacher, and she'd been teaching biology for many years. And this particular unit always took 32 lessons, the unit she was about to embark on. It always took 32 lessons. I said, how many do you have planned? She goes, I have 32 planned. And it always takes 32. Isn't that an interesting coincidence? And she goes, well, sometimes it takes 31, but it's always around this time. So I challenged her with lesson 0, unpacking the success criteria with the learners, having the learners to determine the next step, and then to move forward from there. And you know what happened in her first iteration of this, in the first year, is that learners arrived at success criteria in 16 lessons, not 32 lessons. In other words, they saved 50% of the class time that they normally would have spent in delivering content by having agency over the learning. Oh, and the outcomes also improved by 12%. This is not isolated. This has been in every school that I've worked with agency. In Australia, many schools within a year are up 4 bands higher on NAPLAN, and some of that happened during lockdown. We have dramatic results. We're focusing on literacy with meaning. We're unpacking learning intentions in ways that are meaningful for learners, and of course their language levels increase dramatically. Evelyn Scott School in Canberra is a good example. They've been doing just incredible things there, and they're one of the case studies that I reference in the book. Learners, when you ask them about learning intentions at the primary level, they have some pretty strong feelings about the importance of it. You know, I would say this is successful for us at that school. You know, when it comes to implementing any kind of change like this, there's 3 uns that will be the undoing of any change initiative. Firstly, if you're unaware of what is possible and what to do, of course, nothing can happen. If you're unable to, if you don't have the skills, the resources, the understandings, the training, of course, it's not going to happen. And then the third is unwilling. Some people just don't want to, and these are really the only conditions that allow change to fail. You know, by our traditional measurements of fail. So in this webinar, which is largely provocation, you know, the idea is to create awareness for you, to give you some idea of what's possible, of what you can do. And I hope now that you are aware of what is possible. And the real question is up to you. Are you willing and are you able? If you are willing and you want to be able, then I'll share a challenge with you, which I'm going to call the Agents to Agency Challenge. And 3 parts to it. You can play along with whichever parts you wish to. First is, if you don't have a copy of this book, get a copy from Hawker Brownlow, because you can go through much more detail the content that I've roughly presented to you today. I hope you found value in it today, but there's a lot of stuff to go through in a short period of time, and I've touched on about 25% of the book. So please get your copy. Now, in the chat, because we're going to go into questions in a minute, I'm going to ask you please to post a question. But if you don't have a question, then I'm going to ask you then to share one thing that you've learned today and one action that you're going to take now. Everyone, I would be hoping, is going to post one action they're going to commit to take now. I'm really hoping to see that. So please post your questions in there now, and please post one thing you've learned today or one action you want to take now, either one. But that's what's going to allow us to continue the conversation for the next 10 minutes. Third is, in the Agents to Agency book, my Future Focused Learning Network, which is, you know, Australian educators from all over the country coming together and doing the different master classes. There's a special link which provides you access to this at a great degree of intensity. So master classes on all of these things and learning intentions are there. Also, this is where I'm going to post a copy of the recording, and I'll post all the slides from today as well. So if you join the network in there, take advantage of the free trial, pop in, have a peek around, and you'll be able to get the recording soon here. And then Hawker Brownlow also will email you a copy of the recording should you not wish to access it through the network. But this is where the slides will be posted. So that's everything that I had to share with you. I hope you found some value in this conversation. And as Charmaine, I think, have you been looking at questions? Is there some things that you think that we should chat about here? I see they're kind of wandering in here, so excuse me as I kind of lean over with my old man glasses and have a look at what some of the conversations are that are coming in here. Oh, I love seeing that we're going to redefine learning intentions and objectives in your context. That's incredibly important, and it's going to give you so much more freedom as well. Yeah, learners have a lot of curriculum to learn. Yeah, isn't that an interesting thought? When people say that, I have so much curriculum to teach, then I'll ask the question, well, if you teach the curriculum and the learners don't learn it, have you done your job? And then we pause and we think about it. Well, hang on a second. No, of course learners have a lot of curriculum to learn. Yeah, voice is your say, agency is your way. That's a big one. I'm glad that made sense to you today. Focusing on achievement standards, not the content. Yes, wonderful. Yes, 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 yes. Norel, you love lesson 0. Yay. It's a lot of fun. In the master classes in the network, people actually do their lesson 0 and then record it and post it. That's one of the challenges. So it's really interesting to go in and see what 1,000 other teachers have done on the having a go at what does this look like on the first time. It's a lot of fun, the things that go on in the network. Wonderful. I don't see any specific questions. I'll keep looking here, but I'm really great to hear the positive feedback. Should you Hawker Brownlow is your main point of contact. So if you wish to have us work with your school, or if you're looking to do agency in a deeper level, or just starting with a book study or anything, you can reach me through Hawker Brownlow and book me to work with your school, and look at what this looks like on a much deeper level as well. Wonderful. Any tips for learning intentions in high school special needs classes where we are catering for students accessing curriculum anywhere from Kindy 3 year 10? Yeah. When the thing is that there are some processes, and when you say special needs, it depends on the special need, of course, but there are some ones that are really specific around how we accomplish that. So a lot of special needs learners, particularly those who are on the autism spectrum, and I am not an expert in special education, so I'll clarify that, but in my experience, when they have process and when they have structure, they thrive fairly well. So in the book, we go through a process of destinations, milestones, and footsteps, which is a way that we move. That's the way that I actually work with principals and executive teams to move a school forward. But that's an incredibly powerful process that will allow learners to be really clear on where is it that I'm going, what are the next steps for me, and being able to unpack things fairly well. You'll find that that's really powerful regardless of the year levels. It's what allows us to get to self-direction very quickly, the whole concept of destinations, milestones, and footsteps. So structures and processes around that unpacking. Circling the objects, underlining the verbs, that's a start, right? And then from there, well, what do those words mean? Well, what does this word mean? Who is this group that we're talking about? That structure of unpacking is a process. It's a very clear, structured process. That tied to destinations, milestones, and footsteps is incredibly helpful for all learners, but special needs learners thrive in that environment. Have I been involved with teachers and learners planning together? Yes, of course. That's a big part of what we do. That's essentially what Lesson 0 is. So in the example that I gave you from the Millennium School, the way that they incorporated Lesson 0, they were a flipped learning school. So their focus was on learners doing things outside of school. So at the end of every lesson, it would be very clear. They would say, well, what do we need to do next? What does everybody need to do next individually? And each learner would then identify and plan what the next lesson should be or what the next activity should be. They would go and do the learning and come back for that conversation. At Evelyn Scott School, they're doing a great job of the pedagogy of agency at the high school level, and so those learners are very much we start with inquiry, but then we move to them identifying their own individual project, creating their own essential question tied back to that those achievement standards, and then expanding upon that on their own, which means learners are completely doing this. In schools that I've worked with in other parts of the world as well, at the year 11 to 12 level, where learners are completely self-directing their learning, then it's a process of very much focusing on what does a learner need to do next, and the teacher being the mentor, kind of working in a completely different environment with small stand-up meetings on a daily basis. And that's even happening at Evelyn Scott. So any of you who are in that area, it's really worthwhile to pop in and harass them and see what they're doing. Leadership team has been reading the book, Moved for Pedagogy of Agency. We are planning our next PL day. Any advice on where to start with our teachers? Yeah, wonderful question. A copy of this recording might be helpful, but where to start with the teachers is just having that conversation. The very first thing that I put up, and I do this often in provocation, is ask the question, who's responsible for the learning in the school? And let that play out. I've let that play out for a long time, and it can become quite heated. And sometimes I'll provoke it when they say, well, no, everyone is responsible. And then I'll say, great, to what percentage do we align to each group, and how do we measure their level of efficacy and as far as their responsibility goes? So in what way are the learners responsible, what way are the parents responsible, how do we measure that, and what percentage do we put on each of those groups? Like, I'll unpack it and play it out until it gets uncomfortable, and then ask the question about, well, who's responsible for the learning in our lives? You really need to help teachers to get to the point where they understand that it's the learners that are ultimately responsible for the learning. It sounds so silly, but we've got to get that understanding. One of the challenges that I recognize in change initiatives in schools, and it's unique to education, is that people inside of education have spent their entire lives since the age of 5, 8 hours a day at least, in a classroom. And so by the time a teacher gets to be a teacher, they've had 15 to 20 years of teaching and learning and assessment modeled for them. And it's incredibly challenging to break those mindsets. It's very, very ingrained. So we have to start with some humor and being willing to have a look at ourselves with some silliness. That's where we start, is that. And what is it that we want for learners? For me, a lot of my focus is on rediscovering the joy in what we're doing. I mean, who doesn't want to be joyful in their practice? I don't think any teacher said, I want to become a teacher because my life's ambition is to prepare kids for NAPLAN. That's my, like, no, who says that? Nobody. There's a joy, there's a love around teaching. We need to reignite that and connect to it again. Seems learners are more autonomous and therefore planning would look different. Have you a few lessons planned or ongoing? Yes, so this is a great question. And this comes down to what I was saying about moving responsibility from the teacher. We don't need to plan a term. How do you plan a term? How do you plan a term's lessons? How do you plan for the curiosity of learners? It's incredibly difficult. So you absolutely, as you get into this, you start by having some lessons planned. You start with lesson 0. We uncover what's going to matter for each learner. We get to success criteria. We have learners identify how they're going to achieve that. You definitely have some things planned, but you're planning light and you're planning fluid. You're really only looking at the next 2 or 3 things and then constantly measuring in relation to the success criteria. When you're focusing on the success criteria, you arrive there much, much quicker. Give me a second, I'm reading a very large, yes, okay, so large turnover in staff, how do you accomplish this? Beautiful question. Actually, so I worked a lot in Dubai and in the Middle East, and it's like the Wild West of education. So the private school system that I worked with in Dubai, you have to understand how international education works. It's basically tourist teachers. So, you're coming in for 2 years, and then you're going to go to Singapore, and then you're going to go to Brazil, and you're living that life of hey, I'm making my way around the world while teaching. So, in any one of those schools, I would typically have teachers from a dozen countries with completely different language backgrounds, completely different backgrounds in teaching, completely different backgrounds in curriculum, and yet we would have to move the school forward. On top of that, because you had people on 2-year cycles, largely, well, we would get some people that would stay for 4 years, but largely you're rolling over 40 to 50% of your teaching staff every year. That's why the master classes that I've built are so important. Number one, we create that common language. This is what a learning intention is. This is what success criteria is. This is what a lesson objective is. Building that understanding is incredibly important. So even new teachers coming into one of my established schools are going through those master classes with support of the other teachers to get up to speed on what is this language and how are we using it and what does it mean. Because if I say learning intention, everybody has some idea around what that is. Everyone has an opinion around what that is. Some people will say, well, the learning intention is that we're going to multiply fractions. It's not a learning intention. That's no. So how do we get to that point? We got to make it clear. The structures of the shifts of practices that I have are what make that happen. Creating that common language is the very, very first and most important thing in that. Yes, so the set curriculum. Well, the curriculum is set. the question about what do you do with teachers that have a set curriculum. Of course they have a set curriculum. We all have a set curriculum. The question is not that there is that there is or is not a set curriculum. It's version 9, it exists, it's there. The question is, what are you going to do with it, and how are learners going to arrive at that? That's a mindset shift. As much as teachers may want to just, well, here's my series of lessons that I'm going to do for the year, it can't work that way, because learners are different, constantly are different. And if you are trying to accomplish, if you come back to what is the purpose of the Australian curriculum, the Australian curriculum's purpose is to arrive at the general capabilities. You don't arrive at the general capabilities by delivering a structured series of content. It happens by challenging learners to be autonomous and to build those skills and capacities through accessing their curriculum with a level of agency. That's incredibly important that we do that. Well, thank you, everyone. It looks like we've come to the end of our time, and it looks like we've dripped out of questions. So I really, thank you for your kind and patient attention and your time today. I hope you found value in it, and please take things forward from here and run on with it. And you're welcome to reach out to me in my network. So as I mentioned, you can join the Future Focused Learning Network. I'll put that slide back up again so you have the link, and you can speak to me directly in there. If you want to look at having me at your school, please contact Hawker Brownlow, who can make those arrangements. So thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy your well-deserved term break.